So I was watching Mark Sargent and Karen B recently on a stream in which they were raising money for a European Flat Earth tour, and Mark said something that he's said many times in the past, but this time it got my gears turning. He said, "The Apollo mission footage hasn't aged well." Now, he wasn't referring to the image quality of the footage. NASA has released remastered and enhanced versions of the Apollo footage over the years, and while that is sort of like polishing a turd, that wasn't what Mark was referring to. He was referring to the footage itself. As time marches on and we lose more and more of the baby boom generation, that generation of Americans who were cognizant when the 1969 moon landing was televised, the greater the percentage of Americans there are who look at this footage and say to themselves, "Yeah, right." To baby boomers, this wasn't just a historical event. It was part of their childhood or their teenage and young adult experience. Despite the Apollo missions being conducted largely by those belonging to the World War II and Korean War generation, the greatest and silent generations respectively, baby boomers tend to think that their generation did that because they watched it on television. This footage is part of the baby boom generation's identity. Every generation has these, I suppose. My own generation, Generation X, has their own such watershed moments. Some also having to do with NASA. Try questioning the validity of the Apollo moon landing to a baby boomer. What you will get most often is incredulousness toward what they are hearing from you, and if you continue and show confidence in what you are telling them, or even try to point out anomalies, they will often become personally offended. For some, it takes a while. For others, they skip the incredulity and go right into the personally offended phase. From there comes everything from dismissal to outright insults, which they, of course, consider counterattacks, since you insulted their identity as baby boomers and their cherished, precious memories of the moon landing. You can't get most of them to question the validity of the footage. Most of the time, they just don't want to hear it. They also won't look at it if you tell them to. They'll say they were there when it happened, and that they don't need to look at it. They're fine with what they know, you see. The Apollo footage was given instant credibility as soon as it was publicly displayed. News crews from the then 3 major television networks were filed into a room with a large screen and allowed to, essentially, film a film. The resulting kinescope-like viewing experience that folks watched at home was subpar even for the time. Most viewers simply assumed that the lack of picture quality was due to the distance the signal had to travel to get back to Earth. Back then, cable television was still in its infancy, and most Americans were comfortable with the sort of poor picture quality from their rabbit ear antennas that would thoroughly annoy most people today. Nobody questioned the washed-out black and white footage because it came from what they perceived to be a trusted source. Amidst all the narratives of the Vietnam War in that era, the moon landing was a welcome one. Sargent was definitely right. The footage has aged poorly. This is mostly due to 2 things. The first is the increased sophistication of the average American viewer who, after seeing numerous science fiction film products since 1972 when the Apollo missions officially ended, now looks at the Apollo footage and finds it wanting. They look at the lunar lander and they say, This traveled through the vacuum of space and landed on the moon, and then came back?" Most people today, even the younger ones, know that the space vehicles they see on television shows and in movies aren't real. But even on a conceptual level, their designs make sense. It makes sense to build them sturdy, encapsulated, with no delicate parts on the exterior that would require astronauts to leave the safety of the vehicle in suits to repair or perform routine maintenance. Even Earth-bound submarines are designed in this way, needing divers to work on the exterior components only occasionally while at sea. Many of today's viewers look at these images and ask, why doesn't the dust on the moon's surface show signs that something landed there? In this 1966 painting for Look magazine by none other than Norman Rockwell, the artist clearly understands what it should look like. An encapsulated lander and scorch marks on the surface showing what would happen if a vehicle were to land on such a granulated surface. The second reason the footage has aged poorly, like the first, has nothing really to do with the footage itself, and more to do with the audience. While there are many baby boomers who today question the validity and authenticity of the moon landing footage, the vast majority of those who do are from Generation X, Millennials, or Generation Y, and especially Generation Z. In other words, those generations who never witnessed the 1969 moon landing broadcast when it was live. These people weren't there when it happened, like the boomers. It's not part of their personal history or part of their identity. They don't get offended when meeting someone who doesn't believe the US ever went to the moon. These generations are living in a very different country. They grew up and are growing up in a United States in which the government is always being accused of doing bad things, usually along party lines. They've gone to school, viewed media, and gone on Facebook and read and heard things like Russian collusion, fake birth certificates, and presidents trying to eliminate minority Americans with artificially created hurricanes. At least some of these concepts were introduced to them and refined by perceived reliable sources, like cable news networks. A fake moon mission program is just one more of these ideas. The 1969 moon landing is 50 years old this year. It's been 47 years since we, the human race, last officially visited the moon. That fact alone puzzles the post-boomer. Name something else, some achievement, that we could do 50 years ago, but cannot duplicate or improve upon today. Look at a car from 1969. Now look at any car on the road today. Look at the ease and price of ordinary atmospheric flight in 1969 and then compare it to value jet. But when it comes to going back to the moon, we're told it's too expensive now, that the technology would cost too much today, or that NASA doesn't have the budget it used to have. This just does not compute for most post-boomers. Post-boomers are used to technology starting out expensive and eventually becoming more affordable. Like how the first CD player stereo components cost $600, but in 2 more years, they were under $100. They're used to a 32-inch 1080p television costing $1,000 and 5 years later costing under $200. The longer a technology exists, the cheaper it gets. That's their reality. Then there's this new reason that NASA has recently given for why they won't go to the moon again.
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
When you said that just now, did it sound stupid to you?
Kind of.
But back to the footage. I doubt NASA could have predicted that some 50 years later, an average American could take the footage of the lunar buggy and stabilize it using common software readily available to better scrutinize it. You look at footage like this long enough and something becomes rather clear. There's really nothing here that couldn't be replicated on a film studio. Overcranking a camera while recording and then playing it back at normal speed can give a kind of weightless effect. Lighting and shrouding techniques, along with filming angles, can be implemented to give it the impression of a horizon. Anything that could unequivocally demonstrate that the subjects of footage like this are actually where we are told they are just isn't there. No stars, nothing. Then there are the practical questions. Like, how'd they fit a buggy like this into the lunar lander? What is this thing running on? Batteries? What kind of batteries were available in 1969 through 1972 that could last this long or work this well in the extreme conditions of space and a moon with no atmosphere? If we had those kind of batteries back then, well, why didn't electric cars successfully compete with conventional ones decades ago? Also, that suit. That suit is a technological marvel. What is it running on? Now I'd like to share with you another piece of footage. This footage is totally unrelated to the first group of footage that I've talked about here. This other footage that I'm referring to was filmed about 2 years earlier than the 1969 moon landing broadcast. In 1967, while filming a documentary, two men, Robert Patterson and Bob Gimlin, filmed something. The Patterson-Gimlin film is about 3.5 minutes long, but the part that is known, or rather that it's known for, is the final 59 seconds. Unfortunately, the original film has disappeared. What most people have seen on television and online are third-generation copies at best. Only 7 direct copies of the original are known to exist at this time. When this footage was first revealed to the public in 1969, it wasn't given much credibility. Most people thought it was a hoax, and why wouldn't they? Hoaxes are very, very real. Hoaxes are easier for most people to understand than a man-ape species that has managed to remain largely hidden for generations. Patterson and Gimlin were seen as two hucksters, seeking publicity for a documentary they never did get around to finishing. A documentary, incidentally, about the Ape Canyon, Washington incident of 1924, which involved a group of men encountering ape-like men. Now, it's easy to see why someone looking at this footage would think that this is just a man in some kind of gorilla suit. Gorilla suits were a regular fixture in Hollywood for decades. It was one of the most common ways to depict a gorilla in movies and on television. This might be hard for some of our younger people today to understand, but back then, if you wanted to depict a gorilla interacting with a character on a TV show, you used a man in a gorilla suit. This was what you had. You didn't use a real gorilla, because that would be too dangerous. You didn't use Ray Harryhausen's stop-motion King Kong effects, because those were too time-consuming, particularly for television schedules. You just put a man in a gorilla suit. The audience wasn't fooled. But if the performances were good enough, the audience would engage in willful suspension of disbelief in order to follow the story. They would go along with the illusion. They go along to get along. Everybody knew they were looking at a guy in a gorilla suit. So the first thing your brain would reach for when confronting something that looked like a Sasquatch would probably be a guy in a suit. In the decades since this film was first seen by the public, the Patterson-Gimlin film has been gaining credibility. This is thanks in large part to the efforts of men like M.K. Davis, a Bigfoot footage researcher with a YouTube channel that you should really check out. It's called Greenwave 2010FB. All one word, no spaces. I'll put a link in the description. What you're seeing right now is a transparency that Davis obtained from Patterson's widow, made from the original film. It is of the most famous frame from the film, frame 352. Davis also happens to have one of the few second-generation copies of the film. The detail on Davis's copy is extraordinary, and contains information that subsequent copies made just do not have. The Patterson-Gimlin subject, affectionately nicknamed Patty, can clearly be seen to be sporting breasts. You'd be surprised at how many people have seen this film and do not know that Patty is female. Through stabilization software and a lot of work, Davis was able to give us a better look at the subject. Here we see his stabilized footage superimposed over frame 352. Forget every television show and movie you've seen in which someone was wearing a gorilla suit for just a moment, and look at it. Really look at it. You look at this footage long enough and you start to see things you didn't notice before. You notice what looks like muscle groups moving under the fur-like hair that covers the subject. You notice that when Patty turns and looks at the camera, there isn't the sort of bunching up that fabric tends to do when someone does that, particularly around the neck area. You also notice that Patty doesn't have much of a neck. This was filmed in 1967. That's 2 years before the release of Planet of the Apes. 9 years before the release of the 1976 King Kong film, which featured a gorilla suit made by Rick Baker. And 10 years before the release of Star Wars, where we all first met Chewbacca. So what are you getting at, Darren? Do you actually think the moon landing isn't real and Bigfoot is? Well, given what we're learning as time goes on from these two sets of footage, let's just say I'm more open to the idea than I was 20 years ago. Thing is, I'm not alone in this. Every day, more people look at the Apollo footage and question its authenticity, while every other day, more people look at the Patterson-Gimlin footage and question its ludicrousness. These two sets of footage are like two ships passing each other in the night along the river of credibility, one going upstream and the other headed downstream. Thank you for watching.